So the central policy issue for Obama's presidency is obviously his healthcare reform. We talked in the last class about the emergency that Obama faced on economic issues, having to continue the bailouts of the financial sector and the banks that had begun under the Bush presidency, and then launched the stimulus package that was designed to restart the American economy. Those economic decisions were very much a matter of urgency, a matter of dealing with the crisis that he was confronted with upon arriving in office. And as we saw in the last class, there was a real will on Obama's part to deal with that emergency in as bipartisan a manner as possible. So to avoid making what could be perceived as dramatic policy choices in how he managed the emergency. He's been criticized on that point, as we saw, by more progressive parts of the Democratic Party, who felt that he was wrong to basically try to build the system back up as it had been prior to the crisis, before engaging in the Dodd-Frank legislation. Right? The choice that was made was to save the system and then put into place legislation that would make the system more responsible in the future. For progressives, the choice that would have pleased them more would have been a clear ideological decision to favor Main Street over Wall Street. Obama deals with the financial crisis in a way that is as non-ideological as possible, and then once that emergency has been dealt with, he moves on to the central issue of the central policy issue, I should say, of his presidency, which is healthcare reform. He campaigns on healthcare reform. He makes healthcare reform his main priority in the key months of the primary campaign, the Democratic primary campaign. And once he has dealt with the financial emergency, he switches to his main policy issue. And his main policy issue is healthcare reform. So, in order to evaluate the legislative achievements of Obama's presidency, you have to put healthcare reform front and center, and you have to be able to speak about healthcare reform in a way that is reasonably detailed. And this presentation is aimed to give you the reasonable level of details to a bill which is very complicated, which even most Americans who take advantage now of this healthcare reform don't fully understand. So don't bury yourself in minor details, but it is important that you have a sense of the overall framework of this reform, the major criticisms of it, the major successes that the United States has had since it's been instituted. Before we get into those details, however, I think it's important that we remind ourselves of the basic question of legislative time, political time. Obama has to spend the first months of his presidency dealing with the financial crisis. There are also affairs of government that have to be managed, the appointment of new cabinet officials, getting the administration up and running, working on the different federal agencies, dealing with foreign policy issues, and so on and so on. The amount of time and political capital that Obama has left after his first 100 days is relatively limited. We often speak about the first 100 days of the presidency as a time when a president is able to enact the policies that he presented on the campaign trail. If you don't do something in the first 100 days, the idea goes, you're going to have trouble doing it. Now, Obama's first 100 days were spent primarily dealing with setting up the new administration while managing the crisis in the economic sector. The Republican Party, after those first 100 days, tries to begin already pushing back against Obama's policy initiatives. They say, well, okay, you got the stimulus package, you got some things you want in the stimulus package, and so now you can't come back to us and say, oh, well, that was just for the emergency, here's my real agenda. They say, okay, you got your agenda with the stimulus package. And they begin to put into place the policy of frontal and systematic opposition to everything that Obama proposes. That is going to be their line for the whole remaining 8 years of his presidency. Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, first minority and then majority leader, goes on record as saying it's his job to make sure that Obama is a one-term president, and then after he's not a one-term president anymore, it's his job to make sure that Obama's presidency is a failure. So this is the kind of opposition Obama is facing. The first 100 days he doesn't get to put any policy issues through. When he does manage to turn to policy, it's fairly clear that he's only going to be able to get one or two things done before the midterm elections. The choice that he makes is to focus on healthcare. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is why that choice? Why healthcare? Which we'll do in a moment. But before we ask ourselves that question, let's bear in mind that Obama's choice to focus on healthcare, while understandable, has caused frustration with a number of his constituents. The Latino community, to whom he had spoken about immigration reform. Obama is America's first black president, and yet he chooses health care rather than issues like housing or lower income education or criminal justice reform or police reform that might have been more important specifically to the black community. For environmental activists, Obama's initiatives on the environment, as we'll see later in the course, come near the end of his second term. Why didn't he put those front and center after speaking so much on the campaign trail about the importance of conservationism? So Obama's choice to prioritize healthcare comes some months into his presidency after the emergency of the financial crisis has been dealt with. It's something which is understandable. We're going to be able to answer in a clear way the question, why healthcare? But it's something that's created a certain amount of frustration as we move forward out of the Obama presidency through the Trump presidency and the current 2020 campaign. So, let's ask the question, why healthcare? And I think there are two one-word answers, right? First one-word answer, history. Second one-word answer, consensus. History and consensus. By focusing on healthcare, Obama was able to connect to a long-standing progressive tradition in the Democratic Party of expanding the federal government by creating a social safety net that focused on people's health and well-being. So he connects to the history of his party through the healthcare reform. He's continuing the work of Democratic presidents, beginning with Roosevelt, through Truman, Johnson, attempted work by Bill Clinton, which he never got done, and Obama is picking up this work in 2008. So he's connecting to the history of his party, and he's connecting to an ideological tradition of expanding the federal government's ability to improve living conditions for the middle and lower classes by focusing on an issue that concerns everybody, health. Secondly, consensus, as I just said, an issue that concerns everybody. Obama was very focused on the fact that he needed to be a president for everybody. He did not want to be seen as America's first black president who focused on the issues concerning the black community, or poor black and brown people, or people from traditionally underprivileged groups. He wanted to be everybody's president. He wanted his major policy focus to be on an issue that could create consensus. So, for Obama, second point, healthcare becoming his main political priority is a way of building on the Democratic heritage, the history that goes back to Roosevelt, while making progress on a subject that is of importance to multiple constituencies. Whether you're white, black, Latino, whether you're a young college student, a senior citizen, whether you live in the North or in the South, you need decent health care. So I think those are the two basic answers to this singular focus that Obama articulates around healthcare reform once he has dealt with the financial emergency. So, let's take these two answers to the question, why healthcare, one by one, beginning with the question of history. As I said, the history of the Democratic Party over the course of the 20th century is a history of focusing on the way that the federal government can put programs into place that will benefit the American people, using the federal government, expansion of the federal government, to benefit social programs. Whereas the Republican Party's basic ideological line has been to focus on individual liberties, free market economics, and thus to focus on the need to shrink government. Small government, less taxes, to give individuals as much liberty as possible. So Obama's focus on expanding the federal government by instituting a major healthcare reform connects him to this tradition that begins in the Great Depression under Franklin Roosevelt. The first major phase of healthcare reform comes during the 1930s, during Franklin Roosevelt, FDR's administration, as part of his New Deal. The Social Security Act, passed in 1935, is the first major retirement insurance, disability insurance that is passed by the American government. Now, as part of the discussion around Social Security, Roosevelt and his administration discussed the possibility of instituting universal health care reform. It was a proposal of a publicly funded health insurance that was ultimately left out of the final Social Security Act legislation. Why? Because there was significant political pressure against such reform in 1935, and because it was judged that health insurance could be better promoted through employer-based programs. So the Social Security Act facilitates the growth of employer-based health insurance programs, avoiding putting into place a public government-funded system, but using the government to facilitate employer-based health insurance. This is where we begin in this process of reform. This leads to the growth of, as you see, hospital insurance programs and group insurance programs for employees. If you want to read more about this, these programs come to be called the Blue Cross and Blue Shield programs, which remain active especially through the 80s and 90s, but even up until today. The Blue Cross and Blue Shield programs. Roosevelt understood the attachment that many people had to employer-based health insurance. He decided that it was not a priority to politically push back against that. The priority was retirement reform, Social Security retirement benefits, and disability insurance, and then facilitating health insurance through employers. That's where we begin in the United States, and that has been the sensibility since the 1930s. Many Americans, on the left as on the right, are reluctant to move away from employer-based health insurance. We'll see why in a moment. So, Following World War II, Roosevelt dies in office, of course, in 1944. He is replaced by Harry Truman. Harry Truman is the President of the United States in the years immediately following World War II. And like what's happening in Europe, there's a project to rebuild society, rebuild social connections following the trauma of World War II. In Europe, obviously, the war has been fought on European soil. European societies have to be rebuilt from the ground up. So this is a much more extensive process. Um, and these are the years in Europe where what comes to be known as the welfare state is put into place. So universal government-insured healthcare programs, the welfare state, the sécurité sociale, as part of this reconstruction of European society following World War II. In the United States, the war has not been fought on American soil. America economically profits from World War II in some ways, but there's still this notion of the need to rebuild American society following the war. These are the years of the GI Bill. These are years of funding for public education, the interstate highway system, and so on and so on. So there is this notion of the need to recreate a new social bond within the country following the Second World War. And under Truman, the name that gets given to this new social bond is the fair deal, right? Not a new deal like under FDR, but a fair deal, right? Bringing ordinary people together in a deal that everyone will consider to be fair and just. And again, the Democratic Party, attached to this idea of universal health care, makes a proposal for universal health care as part of the fair deal negotiations. And again, as in the 1930s, it is met with strong opposition by people who preferred employer-based health care. And facing this opposition, the proposal is withdrawn. Like Roosevelt, Truman places the emphasis elsewhere. Mental health, important after World War II, and also the construction of hospitals in rural and underprivileged zones, the modernization of certain hospitals, especially in cities. Okay, so second time, there's the proposal of universal health care. There's a choice to remain with an employer-based system. Now, why? In the European context, people are accepting, these are the years where people are moving towards the welfare state. They're moving towards a government-insured universal health care program. Why doesn't that work in America? And I think there's two pragmatic reasons for that. There's a pragmatic opposition from the left and from the right. The Democratic Party, we talk about first the opposition from the left. The Democratic Party was traditionally, up until the election of Donald Trump, or at least through the Clinton years, the Democratic Party was the party of the labor unions, of the working class, of the industrial Midwest, and many unions working politically with the Democratic Party, negotiating with a certain amount of political strength with their employers, had managed to obtain good healthcare benefits. So if you were a UAW worker, right, a United Auto Workers worker, or if you worked for GM, or if you worked for IBM, or numerous other American firms, you got very good quality health insurance from your employer as part of a stable job. So the working class in these years, protected by strong labor unions, in stable jobs with very stable companies. These are the years of the expansion of the consumer economy, of course. These people had good employer-based health care. They were nervous about giving that up in order to accept a public program that would have to cover a lot more people, including a lot of unemployed people. So there was a fear amongst the labor unions that they would have to give up the benefits that they had obtained through a lot of hard work and a lot of political activism in many cases, that they would have to give these benefits up as a part of any move to a universal healthcare system. So from the left, people who are in good, stable union jobs with good employer-based healthcare are very nervous about any deal that is going to shift to a public universal healthcare system. From the right, there's also a pragmatic resistance, right, of business people who are concerned that the costs of a universal public healthcare system will inevitably lead to a raise in taxes, a raise in regulations that will stifle growth and profits. So there's a resistance to a shift away from employer-based healthcare that comes both from certain workers and from the business community. The next major advance following FDR's New Deal is Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. So the point of departure for Obama's healthcare reforms is the end of the Johnson presidency, the end of these Great Society reforms. Basically, we have a period of about 40 years, beginning with FDR's election at the beginning of the 1930s, 1932, and continuing through the end of Johnson's presidency, 1968. Basically, 1930 to 1970, we have predominantly Democratic administrations, mostly Democratic presidents, who make a number of moves to expand the scope and the power of the federal government. So a series of Democratic presidents between 1930 and 1970 who put into place social programs, creating a stronger social structure for the United States through the federal government, through expansion of the federal government. The 70s are a period of a certain amount of turmoil, of let's say, uncertainty as to where the country is going, what direction the country is going. These are the years of the Vietnam War. These are the years of some of the more chaotic urban riots and disputes over the direction of what had been the civil rights movement. These are the years of Watergate and so on. So the 70s, we had this kind of chaotic political situation through the presidencies of Nixon, Ford, and Carter. And then we have another period of about 40 years, 30 to 40 years, beginning in 1980 with Ronald Reagan's election, primarily Republican presidents, primarily conservative environment between 1980 and really today, to be perfectly honest. Conservative revolution, emphasizing smaller federal government, taking apart some of the features of these social programs that Democratic presidents had put into place, emphasizing free market capitalism, individual liberty, and state rights as opposed to the power of the federal government. This conservative revolution begins under Ronald Reagan, and it continues up until the election of Barack Obama. And you could even say that it has really continued up until today, because we have two powerful Democratic presidents during these years, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And each of those powerful Democratic presidents had a Republican majority in Congress for 6 of the 8 years that they served. Okay? So the Republican Party has had considerably more weight between 1980 and today, whereas the Democratic Party had had considerably more weight between 1930 and 1970. So the end of this period of democratic expansion of the social services, expansion of the federal government, comes to an end with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And Obama, with his healthcare reform, is the first movement since the late 1960s to reconnect with that democratic heritage. Johnson's Great Society makes 2 major advances on the subject of healthcare. These are called Medicare and Medicaid. To simplify what happens in the Great Society, there are basically two branches of reform that take place. There is civil rights reform, right? Civil rights reform, Voter Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, uh, um, legislation to promote equality between the sexes. There's this civil rights legislation that takes place as part of the Great Society. And then we have social services, especially healthcare legislation, that is put into place as part of the Great Society. For the healthcare part, which is what concerns us here, the key terms are Medicare and Medicaid. So, Medicare is a national health insurance program begun in 1966, expands the Social Security Administration, and it provides health insurance for Americans aged 65 and older, but also for some younger people with disability status. And where does this extra protection for people with disabilities come in? It comes in under Richard Nixon in 1972. So you see, well, Obama, with his Affordable Care Act, met with frontal opposition by Republicans. The Republican Party couldn't sanction any aspect of what Obama was doing. It was un-American. In the years between the Johnson and Nixon administration, we have a certain continuity. There was a consensus between the centrists in both parties. So when Nixon, a conservative president for the time, obviously, came into office, he was by no means seeking to undo the reforms of the Great Society. He expanded on them. He expanded on them by protecting people with disabilities. Well, it's an interesting contrast to the polarized political context that we are unfortunately living in today. So Medicare for older Americans, basically providing health insurance for people aged 65 and more. Medicaid is a program for low-income Americans. So a federal and state program that's going to be important to bear in mind for what comes a little bit later. The federal government works together with the states in order to provide low-income people access to certain kinds of basic medical care. There are about 80 million low-income and disabled Americans who benefit from Medicaid today. An example of the type of thing that Medicaid can do: if you're an older American who needs to go into a nursing home, nursing care and EHPAD, right, for an elderly person who is becoming dependent, what will typically happen is you begin paying for that senior care through private means, right? Let's say you've saved up $400,000 over the course of your life. You have assets that are worth $400,000. That might or might not be enough to pay for your senior care, depending on how long you live. So you go into a senior care institution, a nursing home. You present the private means that you have to pay for that senior care, and you begin paying for your senior care out of those private means. And then once you reach a certain level of dependence, right, once your private means have gone below a certain threshold, typically a very low threshold, then Medicaid kicks in. You're not put out of your nursing home, but the government pays for the health costs for the remainder of your life. So if you end up living for 25 years beyond the time you go into the senior care facility, you're not going to be thrown out once your private means have been exhausted. So that's one example of the type of health service that Medicaid provides. All right. So that's where we are in 2008 when Obama runs for election and wins the presidency. He wins the presidency on this idea that he is going to succeed in bringing forward this tradition of reform to social services, using the federal government to provide greater health care to more Americans. Bill Clinton had done the same thing in 1992, and he did not manage to succeed with that. It was not a policy that ever turned into legislation under the Clinton administration. It was the great failure of Clinton's presidency for Democrats was that he was unable to enact universal health care reform. Obama is going to try to be the president who succeeds where Bill Clinton failed. So he runs in 2008 on the promise of a reform to the healthcare system that will provide universal health care while controlling the cost of prescription drugs. This promise is a promise that carries forward a long-standing goal of the Democratic Party that had not been delivered by Roosevelt or Johnson or Clinton. Right? Roosevelt and Johnson and Truman as well take steps in that direction, but we haven't had any significant progress from the Johnson administration until 2008. So for 40 years, we had stayed where we were at the end of these great society reforms, which meant a lot of uninsured low-income Americans and working Americans right between the ages of 18 and 65. Both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama run on the promise of universal health care reform in 2008. Hillary Clinton wants to finish the job that her husband wasn't able to get done in the 1990s. Barack Obama wants to do very close to the same thing. The only debate between the two is on the technical means of accomplishing that goal. The vision that Obama defends in these debates, and if you're interested in the more minor technical details, that goes beyond what I can do in a course like this one. But if you're interested in the technicalities, you should look at some of those Clinton, Obama, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama debates for the 2008 primaries. Look it up, 2008 Obama Clinton debate healthcare, and you'll find clips on YouTube that give you these sorts of exchanges. Obama's vision is a national health insurance exchange that includes private insurance plans as well as a government-run public option. In other words, he doesn't want to make the mistake that previous Democrats have made of shifting away from employer-based private policies. He takes on board the fact that Americans are attached to employer-based health insurance. He doesn't want to take that away and replace it with public health insurance. He wants the public health insurance to be simply one option amongst many in a national health insurance exchange. So the government sets certain rules, provides one option amongst many, and then people can take it or leave it. They can keep their private insurance if they so desire. The other aspect of this reform that he proposes, as I just said, regulation. The insurance industry has been unregulated for decades. It's begun to engage in abuses that everybody, whether you're conservative or liberal, can see and are displeased with. So there's a need for regulation that Obama feels everyone can see. Government has to regulate certain features of the insurance industry in order to provide everybody, whether they're on a public or a private plan, with more stable health insurance. The example that you can easily quote of this, which is the most commonly quoted example in all these debates, is pre-existing conditions. In the unregulated pre-2008 market, the insurance companies are able to charge more or refuse customers if those customers are deemed to be a bigger risk to the company's bottom line. In other words, if you are a childhood cancer survivor and at 20 you apply for a health insurance plan, you have a pre-existing condition, you have had cancer as a child, and so the company can either refuse to take you on or make you pay significantly more than you would otherwise have to do. Okay? If you have diabetes, you have a pre-existing condition. If you're obese, if you're a smoker, you have a pre-existing condition in many of these plans. So the number of people who are paying exorbitant premiums for private insurance policies prior to 2008 on the basis of this pre-existing condition notion is extremely high. Certain plans even consider women under childbearing age to be a higher risk, and so are forcing women to pay more than men because there's a higher risk of health costs related to childbirth. Okay, so we're in a system which is kind of run amok. The private system, the profit motive, has created a situation that any decent person, be they conservative or progressive, is dissatisfied with. So regulation is necessary in order to reform this state of affairs. Everyone can agree on that. The question is how to do it. All right. So before we start talking about how to do it, about the details of Obama's Affordable Care Act, the health reform that he proposes, let's take a step back and let's focus on the big picture. For the purposes of a critical argument that you will be putting forward, the key thing is to keep your focus on the major policy issues, the major intellectual critical concerns that are in play, right? How do we analyze this history? How do Obama's choices fit within a larger historical narrative? Okay, so what is the big picture? And you've got to keep your eye on that and not lose yourself in relatively minor details. I'm going to try to summarize the big picture in 4 slides. So first of all, the history of it. Obama's healthcare reform is first and foremost, for many people, a major ideological statement. Why are the Republicans so hell-bent to stop this healthcare reform and to try to challenge it once it's in place? Because it is the first major expansion of the federal government since Johnson's Great Society. It's not just that it deals with health, it deals with the image that people have of the federal government, the role that the federal government should have in the lives of individuals, and the power of the federal government as opposed to the power of the states. In other words, it is a reform that pushes back against the most basic principles of Ronald Reagan's conservative revolution of the 1980s. And if you want to fill out this part of the big picture, look at the video of Ronald Reagan's inaugural address in 1981, where he's challenging the history of democratic expansion of the federal government, and he says, government is not the solution, government is the problem. Okay? So Obama is making a major ideological statement against the conservative ideology that has been dominant in the United States since Reagan was elected in 1980. It's the first significant push back against that ideology by the Democratic Party since 1980. In order to push back in this way, Obama makes a major compromise. He's the first Democrat to focus on healthcare reform without challenging the basic premise of employer-based healthcare. In other words, he is going to gain this major ideological victory that you see in the first bullet point by making a compromise on the means of achieving that policy goal. So, like Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman before him, he accepts that it is not the moment to challenge the basic premise of employer-based healthcare. He's going to make the compromise with the more progressive wing of his party. I'll give you healthcare, but you're not going to get healthcare reform through a government-based system. We're going to stay in an employer-based system. Okay? So those are 2 enormously key ideological points to bear in mind. Second point of the big picture. Conflict within the Democratic Party. When Obama goes to Congress with his vision of what the Affordable Care Act should be, He goes there looking to compromise. He is convinced that it will be possible to achieve a compromise within the Democratic Party that will also allow the Democrats to bring a few Republicans on board with them. He's wrong. The compromise in the Democratic Party turns out to be much more difficult and much more painful than Obama thought it would be, and he is unable to bring a single Republican on board with his healthcare reform. So Obama spends months and months and months going over draft after draft after draft of this legislation, thinking that he will achieve a legislative victory in a bipartisan manner, in a manner that unites all of the Democrats around a common vision and brings a few moderate Republicans with them. He doesn't bring a single Republican, and the debate within the Democratic Party illustrates a divide within the Democrats that is only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as the years go by. So, the passage of this legislation is a subject of a major battle in Congress. It's a battle between the Republicans and the Democrats. This is the first moment where we see the Republicans' refusal to give any ground to the Obama agenda. The Republicans are going to oppose everything that Obama does as a bloc from this point on. And the Democrats are forced to come to a very painful compromise within their party between the moderates and the progressives. And the casualty of this compromise is the public option that Obama wanted. The idea that the government wouldn't be the only provider of health care, but in order to keep the private companies honest and to give poorer Americans a plain, basic health care option, the government would offer a public health care plan. It will be one provider amongst many. That disappears. It's an entirely private, employer-based plan following this compromise between moderate and progressive Democrats. In the House of Representatives, which the Democrats controlled in 2008, the Democrats are willing to support a bill that contains the public option. But a handful of moderate to conservative Democrats in the Senate say no. And if you want to have an illustration of this sort of democratic vision, the person who came to symbolize it was the Virginia senator, a man by the name of Jim Webb, W-E-B-B, who called himself, he was part of a group that called themselves the Blue Dog Democrats, guard dogs watching over the blue swing states. Jim Webb, W-E-B-B, became a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president in 2016. He did pretty badly. And he speaks about this process in Congress, saying that he doesn't regret voting for the compromise they arrived at, but he said the process was much too complicated. There were thousands of pages of text that nobody could read. We lost the American people with the complexity of this debate. We should have done something much less ambitious, much simpler. So that moderate vision in the Senate is what puts an end to the public option. So the second part of the big picture is how painful the battle in Congress is. It drags on and on and on. By the time it's over, the Democrats are divided, the Republicans are in a mode of frontal opposition, and the American public is fed up hearing about the fights over this issue. This battle in Congress goes a long way towards explaining why Obama does so poorly, Obama and the Democrats, I should say, do so poorly in the 2010 midterms. Big picture part 3, the Republican side of the equation. So I just said the Republicans managed to create a bloc opposing this healthcare reform, in part for the ideological reason that I gave in Big Picture Part 1. They were against any expansion of the federal government. They didn't want to give the Democrats an ideological victory that would go against the basic premises of their party on small government that have been there since Ronald Reagan. So the Republicans unite in their opposition to healthcare reform. And since that moment where they're able to unite in 2010 around this resistance in Congress, resistance to healthcare reform has been the signature issue for the Republican Party. It was Republicans who began speaking about Obamacare, right? The idea was you connected personally to Obama, right, rather than making it part of a larger debate between the two parties. And for many critics of what the Republican Party has become, they would point out that it's not a coincidence that the Republicans are trying to connect this ideological social issue to the country's first black president personally, a way of discrediting the legislation by connecting it to a president who is to be discredited by a certain racist fringe in the American scene. The Republicans managed to keep their caucus unified in their rejection of any compromise on the issue. Republicans have not compromised on this issue since it was put before them in Congress in the first 2 years of Obama's presidency. And then after the legislation, sorry for the typo, after the legislation passed, the Republican line, okay, it became the law of the land. It was signed into law by Obama. The Republican line since then was to repeal and replace healthcare, the healthcare law. The Affordable Care Act, you had to repeal and replace. That is to say, you first pass a law that undoes the basic premises of Obamacare. You pass a law that nullifies all of the premises of the Affordable Care Act. And then, once you've got rid of the Affordable Care Act, you decide how to replace it with something else. This has always been a bit of a non-starter for reasons that we will see. Repealing was a possibility. All Republicans could unite around the idea that we didn't want this law, but replacing was something the Republicans were never able to formulate. There was never a Republican replacement plan for the Affordable Care Act. Another way that the Republicans have resisted this law has been using the House majority to definance aspects of the healthcare system. We'll see that in a moment as well. And then they've also tried to challenge aspects of the Affordable Care Act law at the state level and in the courts. So every lever of power that the Republicans have had since 2010, they have used it in their resistance to this legislation. So it's a signature, an issue of identity, really, for the Republican Party since the law has passed, has been their resistance to this legislation. Finally, the division within the Democratic Party. We just talked about the Republicans. Let's talk about the Democrats. The fourth part of the big picture is what happens within the Democratic Party after the signature of the ACA. Within the Democratic Party, unrest has continued in spite of the fragile compromise that I just described, the compromise between moderates and progressives that got rid of the public option. Moderates within the Democratic Party have accepted that compromise and have wanted to try to build on the ground that was put into place during those congressional debates back in 2010. So moderates like Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton have focused on defending the ACA against Republican attacks and making technical adjustments to the legislation as those become necessary, dealing with issues like rising costs of deductibles, dealing with ways of managing tax credits, this sort of technical adjustment at the margins of the law. Whereas the progressive line in the Democratic Party, which really came into focus in around 2015 or 2016, at the end of Obama's presidency, because it was impossible to challenge the legislation frontally when Obama was still in power, when he still had elections to run. But by the end of Obama's presidency, progressives like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren rally around this idea of what they called Medicare for all. In other words, a universal, public-managed health system like Medicare is. They want to use Obamacare as a step towards what has been the Democratic dream since the 1930s, universal public-funded healthcare system. And the slogan that Bernie Sanders finds, Medicare for all, comes to have a certain amount of power and resonance because he has the the clever idea of connecting this idea of a universal government-run healthcare system with a program that is already in place and is already popular. Right? Medicare already exists, is already in place, was supported by Democratic and Republican presidents alike since the 1960s. Uh, and people have come to trust and value their Medicare without even associating it with the federal government. So you have pictures, for example, during the 2016 campaign between Trump on one side and Sanders and Clinton on the other side. You have pictures of these conservative Trump supporters saying, "I'm not going to let the government get their hands on my Medicare." Right? Well, of course, Medicare is a government program. But there's this sense where the population has appropriated this program, they trust it, it's just part of the landscape. So whereas universal government-run healthcare seems like socialism, Medicare for all could seem just like an issue of social justice. We already have Medicare. We're not a socialist country. So why not Medicare for all? So that's the way that the progressives have tried to advance on this subject in a much more, let's say, decisive way than moderates like Biden or Clinton. Okay, so there's the big picture. The ideological question connected with American history, the question of how the compromise took place within Congress, those fierce congressional debates around the ACA, the question of what it means for the Republican Party, the question of what it means for the Democratic Party. Now, having given the big picture, let's take a few moments to look at some of the smaller details. How does the Affordable Care Act, or the ACA, work? First of all, it is a market-based health plan that establishes a system of private health insurance plans which compete with one another in a government-sponsored marketplace. So ACI-compliant health insurance plans, that is to say, they are plans that meet government standards, government regulations, that are presented to consumers in a marketplace that the government underwrites, the government helps to present and certifies, and then consumers get to choose between these private plans. The key things there, we don't change the employer-based healthcare system. We're still in the logic of a free market-based plan. The government is just there to facilitate consumer choice and to ensure basic minimum standards. So it is not at all like the NHS in the UK or the Sécurité Sociale in France. Right? A very different mindset behind this vision of healthcare. Some of the most obvious abuses of the existing unregulated healthcare system were eliminated under the ACA. The most obvious example of these abuses is the pre-existing condition example that I just gave you. But other abuses include sexism, right? That being a woman was a pre-existing condition. The abuse of the number of uninsured Americans, right? Most basically, because health insurance plans were expensive and could be very expensive if you had a pre-existing condition. The number of uninsured Americans was skyrocketing at the time of Obama's election in 2008. And then underinsured, another abuse of the system before 2008, were the number of people who were underinsured in the United States. So you had health insurance, but it didn't cover certain basic things like prenatal care, care throughout a pregnancy, care for certain pediatric problems, the ability for children to see a pediatrician rather than a general practitioner up to a certain age, and so on and so on. So there's a whole list which you can find on the different presentations online of the ACA. There's a whole list of health problems, or of health needs, I should say. There's a whole list of health needs that were frequently not covered by insurance plans prior to the passage of the ACA, and that the ACA made it obligatory for ACA-compliant health insurance plans to cover. All right? So those are the two basic advances that we see: an end to this idea of pre-existing conditions, and then an expansion to the health needs that are covered by ACA-compliant plans. What else does the ACA do? It expands Medicaid. So you get the benefits of Medicaid, this Johnson-era program, if you, as a family, are earning up to 138% of the federal poverty level. So you don't have to be technically poor to benefit from Medicaid. So people up to 138% of the federal poverty level are able to take advantage of Medicaid. Remember, Medicaid federal funds that are given to the states to distribute. There's federal money that goes through the states. So the states have to agree to this expansion of Medicaid. Some of them won't, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The ACA also extends the amount of time that young adults can remain on their parents' health insurance plans. So up until the age of 26 now, after the passage of Obamacare, if you're a young worker, a young student, you can stay on your parents' plan up until the age of 26. Obamacare provides tax credits for lower income families, making it easier for them to purchase health insurance. So if you fall just above that threshold for the Medicaid expansion, if you're at 145% of the federal poverty level, you're still not doing very well. You might have a hard time buying health insurance on top of your other financial obligations. But the government is going to help you in the form of a tax credit, right? You can write some of the costs of buying health insurance off your income taxes. Okay? Finally, individual mandate. Probably the most controversial, the most often attacked feature of the Obama healthcare plan, forcing all those who meet certain income conditions to either purchase or otherwise obtain health insurance. And if you don't do that, then you pay a tax. Okay, so this individual mandate, the government is forcing you, if you are over 26, if you fall under certain income conditions, you are being forced by the government to buy health insurance. Why? Because the ACA is negotiated between the political parties, but also between the different health professionals, with doctors groups, with pharmaceutical groups, with the insurance companies. And this is the way that the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies are ensured that they will not lose money on the Affordable Care Act. It gets these very powerful business groups, health business groups, on board with the ACA. Okay, you're going to have to spend more because you're going to be obliged to take on people with pre-existing conditions. You're going to be obliged to expand coverage to cover things like prenatal care. You'll be spending more on those obligations. But at the same time, this law is forcing young, healthy people to buy insurance from your companies, to make use of your services. And so the money that those people bring into the system will offset the money that you spend on the sicker, older population or people who have pre-existing conditions. The idea is it's a win-win. We don't create an extra burden that will make the insurance companies or the pharmaceutical companies go under. We provide the extra health care that poorer, sicker, older Americans need. And we also create a system that moves towards universal health care by bringing these younger adults into the marketplaces. The individual mandate brings the younger adults into these marketplaces, and so it expands the base. And the idea is this is sold to the younger adults, but you will need health insurance someday too. And who knows when someone might have a terrible accident and need health insurance without expecting that they will do so. Okay, so those are the 6 basic features of how the Affordable Care Act works. Obviously, there are hundreds and hundreds of pages of the fine print, but in terms of the details that you should need you should be able to mobilize for the exam. I think those 6 bullet points are the main ones. We stay in a marketplace-based plan. We do away with some of the abuses of the existing system, like pre-existing conditions, like underinsured Americans. We expand Medicaid. We extend coverage for young adults who can stay on their parents' plan up to the age of 26, so we help students. We provide tax credits for lower income families, make it easier to purchase health insurance, and then the individual mandate to bring these healthy young adults who might feel that they don't need insurance into the marketplaces. What do these provisions accomplish? The most obvious accomplishment of, quotes, Obamacare is the drastic reduction that it produced in the number of uninsured Americans. By the end of Obama's 2 terms in office, we're down to only, again in quotes, only 8.8% of uninsured Americans by the end of his 2 terms in office. 20 million more Americans are insured after the passage of the ACA. So when you just see it in numbers like that, it's easy to read on and not register the full weight of what that means. 20 million lives are changed by the health insurance that the ACA provided. 20 million people are insured today that were not insured at the beginning of Obama's presidency. This becomes even more important when you look at the questions of equality between ethnic groups. The ACA helps facilitate a reduction in racial inequality in the domain of health coverage. It brings an end to the discrimination on the basis of pre-existing conditions. So these terribly painful situations of people who are left to go uncovered or to not receive treatment they need because they're uninsured after having been a cancer survivor. These stories come to an end for the most part, are reduced following the passage of the ACA. It provides economic relief for lower income Americans through the expansion of Medicaid, right? If you don't have to pay for health insurance as part of your yearly budget when you're a family who's earning, let's say, 120% of the federal poverty level, then you have funds that are free to engage in other economic activities, right? So there is an element of economic relief for lower income Americans that is part of the ACA. And this is the answer that Obama and his administration would give to the sort of criticism we talked about in the last class on Obama's economic policy. This is the answer that we can give to progressives like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, who would push for a wealth tax or for a more radical reform of how the economic system works. The Obama people would say we worked within the system we had, we managed to pass legislation, we focused on an issue that concerns everybody, healthcare. That issue is related to the question of racial injustice, and it's an issue that also has an economic element to it. So Bernie Sanders' rhetoric might sound good, but we managed to provide economic relief in a very practical way to lower income Americans. That's the sort of fight that Sanders and Hillary Clinton had in 2016 when they were arguing in the primary campaign over the legacy of Obama's presidency. What are some of the problems with the ACA? Right? What would moderate Democrats or conservative Republicans point out? In spite of the passage of the ACA, there have been increasing costs of healthcare. It has not done as much as people hoped to reduce rising healthcare costs. Americans spend a disproportionate amount of money on healthcare, and that has not changed since the passage of the ACA, especially this question of rising deductibles. In other words, the amount of money that you have to pay before the insurance kicks in. The cost of deductibles in most of these ACA plans has only gone up since the passage of the Act. So it puts pressure on middle class and upper middle class Americans, these people who are not covered by Medicaid, who can't take advantage of the tax credits, but who have to or are obliged to pay for their health insurance under the terms of the ACA. They have to pay increasingly high premiums, and then especially if they do get sick, they've been paying premiums, they've been paying into the system. Before they get any coverage, they have to pay what seems to be a crushingly high deductible, right? Sometimes into the thousands of dollars. The reason for this is that insurance companies have taken advantage of the individual mandate to overcharge the healthy population. Right? So the individual mandate was a gesture towards the insurance companies, and for many consumer advocates, the insurance companies have taken advantage of the individual, sorry again for the typo, mandate. This is one explanation of rising deductibles. Another explanation, again, Obama's people negotiated with the pharmaceutical industry. They negotiated with the insurance companies. The pharmaceutical industry has not done anything to reduce rising drug prices. The power of the pharmaceutical industry has only grown since the passage of the ACA. So critics, progressive critics of the bill especially, but even some conservative critics, would say that the ACA was a way of institutionalizing the power of these big pharmaceutical corporations, of these big insurance companies. Basically, the Stoller criticism that I gave in the economic policy class, Obama doesn't do enough to reduce the power of monopolies and big corporations. The ACA, it's passed in a negotiation with pharmaceutical lobbies, with the lobbies of insurance companies. It can be seen as an example of giving too much power to an already overly powerful sector of the economy. And the fact that America, since the 2010s, has been in the throes of a more and more severe opioid addiction crisis, only adds to this criticism of the ACA. The pharmaceutical industry judged as being responsible in part for this opioid addiction crisis, and yet the pharmaceutical industry is profiting from the system set up under the ACA. Finally, in the form and the content, the ACA is an enormously complicated piece of legislation. There are problems with presentation and clarity of the marketplaces that are established by this law. It has a lot of moving parts, and its complexity has created problems in both form and substance. A lot of people have to use this law without understanding how it works. All right, so a few graphs to kind of illustrate the major benefits. Before I give you a little bit of further reading, if you want to go into a little bit more detail about the mechanisms of this law and how it works. You see the uninsured rate over the course of Obama's second term. This is just the second term, right? So we've already dropped since 2010 in the passage of the law. We're going from 41.8 million Americans down to 28.1 that are uninsured. Sorry. And then if we break it down by age, race, education, poverty status, you see that the people who benefit disproportionately from the Affordable Care Act are poorer, less educated Americans, Black and Hispanic Americans. But everyone benefits, but certain groups benefit disproportionately, which is exactly what Obama wanted politically. Right? He did not want to be the president for just Black or Hispanic, young or old Americans. He wanted to be everyone's president, and this set of graphs, I think, gives a good illustration of what he was hoping to accomplish through the Affordable Care Act. He was hoping to do something that would help especially those less privileged communities, but that would be a benefit to everyone, that would be part of a national heritage of his presidency. To conclude with these details, a little bit of further reading. First, a progressive view of what the ACA accomplished. I think you should be able to just, if you can't click on the link, you should be able to just copy and paste it from the PDF file. And then you also have a conservative view on problems with the ACA. Again, make sure that you focus on an argument around the key issues that are raised by this act. Don't lose yourself in the more minor details. Now, the question of polarization and division between the Republican and Democratic parties that is unfortunately, such an important part of Obama's presidency. The Republican Party, since the ACA was passed, has relentlessly attacked this legislation. And up until now, it has survived for the most part. So it's important to bear in mind how these Republican attacks take place and why, for the most part, they are unsuccessful. The why, I think we dealt with previously. There's an ideological reason for this. Republicans are against larger federal government. They're determined to make Obama's presidency a failure, and so they unite around this act, which is both Obama's signature legislation and the first expansion of the federal government since the Johnson administration. So there's an element of this that is ideological and illogical. They want Obama to be a failed president, and so they don't want his signature act to succeed. They want small government, individual liberty, free market capitalism, and so they do not want an ideological statement that supports the federal government and that asserts a more socially based vision of American society. So the why we've talked about. Let's now look at the how. Beginning in 2010, remember, the Republicans win the 2010 midterm elections, and the Republicans are going to have the means to challenge the Affordable Care Act for the 10 years that follow, from 2010 up until today. Beginning in 2010, the Republicans will have the House of Representatives and they will have the Senate. In 2016, with the election of Donald Trump, they will have the presidency, they will have both houses of the Congress, and they will have also a very conservative Supreme Court. And then beginning in 2018, the Republicans lose the House of Representatives. So between 2010 and 2016, the Republicans, and 2018, between 2010 and 2018, the Republicans have significant levers of power to attack the ACA. And from 2016 to 2018, they have all the levers of power to attack the ACA. So why is the ACA still here? Let's take a look. First of all, the slogan that the Republicans devised almost immediately after the act was passed was repeal and replace. That is to say, you pass a law in Congress that reverses the provisions of the ACA, and then you pass another law to deal with the issue of health care using conservative Republican principles. This was always probably a non-starter, because the Republican Party never managed to formulate what any sort of replacement plan would look like. There was never a draft of a Republican alternative to the Affordable Care Act. Repealing the Affordable Care Act was a possibility, but once it had been repealed, the process of replacing Obamacare would have been impossible ideologically, pragmatically, for the Republican Party. They would not have been able to come together around any sort of a replacement plan for what they called Obamacare. So repeal, yes, that's a possibility. They almost managed to do it. Replace, always a non-starter. The repeal and replace strategy came to an end in 2016 following Donald Trump's election. Donald Trump had the Republican senators write up legislation that would repeal the Affordable Care Act and had the Senate vote on it in the middle of the night. And this effort failed when 3 Republican senators, the decisive vote being John McCain, Obama's opponent in the 28 election, sided with the Democrats and blocked the effort to repeal the ACA. I'm going to show you just a 5-minute news clip that describes this process. These Republican senators being ordered by the White House to send Mike Pence, the vice president, over to the Senate to cast a deciding vote, if need be, if it finishes 50-50. Orders the senators to write up a repeal law. They do it very quickly over one day. They vote on it. They're trying to vote on it in the middle of the night to get it done as fast as possible with as little political fallout as possible. And at a certain point, they realize that they just don't have the votes amongst their own senators. And the effort to repeal and replace comes to an end when John McCain says, no, I will not support this effort to repeal. So let's look at this clip and see how this all plays out on the Senate floor in 2016.
This process is an embarrassment. This is nuclear-grade bonkers, what is happening here tonight. We are about to reorder 1/5 of the American healthcare system, and we are going to have 2 hours to review a bill which at first blush stands essentially as healthcare system arson.
To understand the absolutely stunning drama that unfolded on the Senate floor last night, you have to start just minutes before 10 p.m. when Senate Republicans first posted the text of their health care bill, an 8-page repeal of the Affordable Care Act, written that day over lunch. Now, Democrats would have 2 hours to review it before a midnight vote, the possibility of reordering America's healthcare system in the dead of night with Americans asleep. Immediately, Democrats rose one after the other to speak out against the bill and the idea of jamming it through the Senate overnight. After McConnell first introduced the bill, just one Republican senator would take to the floor for the GOP. That was Senator Mike Enzi of Wyoming, who intended to hold the floor at all costs.
Does the senator yield for a question?
I think this is under my time.
If I could just respectfully ask the chairman, since we've only had this bill for an hour, we have, as you can see, a number of senators who want to speak, and I just would respectfully ask if there's any time that we will have between now and the vote to make any comments, since we just have had the bill for a very short amount of time that we'll be voting on that will obviously impact millions of Americans.
Well, I think the answer that I gave was perhaps your time might be better spent taking a look at the bill.
As the clock ticked toward midnight, Vice President Pence arrived on the Hill to potentially cast a deciding, tie-breaking vote to chants of shame from protesters. The first vote of the night began at 20 minutes after midnight, the last lever Democrats could pull, which was a request to send the bill to committee for debate. Now, that vote would certainly fail, and it did. But here's the thing. Even with all the votes counted for that first vote, McConnell kept that first vote open, talking to Vice President Pence on the floor, and it was becoming clear he was stalling. Nearby, John McCain was talking to 2 senators who'd criticized the bill, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. Then Pence was talking to McCain. McConnell did not have the votes, and the vice president was trying to change that, and they kept the vote open for over an hour. The clearest foreshadowing happened shortly after 1 a.m. when McCain walked over to a crowd of Democrats. They were joking around and smiling. McCain even put his arm around Dianne Feinstein. It was approaching 1:30 when the main crucial climactic vote began. Collins voted no. Murkowski voted no. But McCain didn't answer when his name was called. He'd walk in seconds later, stand in front of McConnell, and ask for the clerk's attention.
Mr. Peters.
As BuzzFeed noted, you could look at this one moment like a Renaissance painting, what each person was doing when that third Republican vote was cast to kill the bill. Something several Democrats have told All In, they did not know what would happen for sure until they witnessed it. Bernie Sanders nudging Senator Jeanne Shaheen, the vote was coming. Amy Klobuchar and Bob Casey on their feet waiting in anticipation. Then Sherrod Brown slapping the desk. Elizabeth Warren leaning to see what would happen and then unable to resist cheering for McCain's vote. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, look at that, trying to quiet his exuberant colleagues as the
Mr.
audible
Portman.
gasps and smatterings of applause. And of course, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, arms folded, staring at McCain, watching him walk
Portman.
off the floor, knowing the bill was dead, as the crowds outside would
Mr.
find out
Reid.
seconds later. After that vote, Leader McConnell addressed the Senate, saying it's time to move on and acknowledging the defeat.
This is, clearly a disappointing moment. We worked hard, and everybody on this side can certainly attest to the fact that we worked really hard to try to develop a consensus for a better way forward. So yes, this is a disappointment. A disappointment indeed.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep
Okay, so that video gives you a clear sense of just how close the Republican Party came following the election of Donald Trump to repealing the Affordable Care Act. Right? That was the moment where the Affordable Care Act almost died, probably not to be replaced by any alternative legislation. We would have been talking about a replacement as part of the current political campaign had John McCain not voted as he did. Once the Republicans had lost that attempt to repeal the ACA back in 2016, what they were able to do was, as part of the Trump tax cuts of 2017, the next year, they included a provision eliminating the tax penalty that was part of Obamacare's individual mandate. The idea that if you didn't buy healthcare insurance on one of these exchanges, you had to pay a tax penalty. This was eliminated as part of the 2017 Trump tax cuts. So, having failed to repeal the ACA as a whole, they took the teeth out of the individual mandate. So, those were the political attempts to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. Another strategy that Republicans adopted was the strategy of defunding the ACA. Beginning in 2010 and continuing through until 2018, the Republican Party had control of the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives is the part of the government that controls budgets. They have the power of the purse. They control the money that is spent by the federal government. So since the Republicans held the House of Representatives, even without changing the law, they could change the way in which money was spent in support of the law. So, for example, they could threaten to cut off tax credits to low-income families. They could threaten to cut off credits to state governments who had signed up for the expansion of Medicaid. Right? They wouldn't get those Medicaid payments if the House of Representatives didn't agree to them. Now, the Republicans threatened repeatedly to do just this as a way of pointing out what the ACA cost the federal government, but such defunding generally remained just that, only a threat. Because think of the political cost that such an action would have had. People who have grown used to having tax credits, people who do their yearly budget thinking that they are going to get X $100 off of their expenses as part of the tax credit, and that find, well, because of these Republican efforts to defund, you're going to have to pay $700 more this year on health insurance. Or people in states who have accepted the expansion of Medicaid, who've grown used to taking advantage of Medicaid benefits, and who find themselves suddenly off of Medicaid. Why? Well, because the Republican Party defunded the Affordable Care Act. That sort of defunding would have carried enormous political cost. So for that reason, the Republicans generally threatened to do it, but only in limited cases did they actually do so. Politically, it was not a very effective strategy. And indeed, in the video that I just showed you, why is all of that drama taking place in the middle of the night? Because people, including moderates, including certain conservatives, by 2016 had grown used to having the benefits of the Affordable Care Act. Right? The Republicans did not want to spend a lot of time or have a long debate on this subject. They wanted it to be ended quickly. They wanted to be able to try to spin it in a way that was positive to them, but they did not want much scrutiny of what they were doing to a legislation that helped a lot of their constituents. So politically, the Republicans are in a difficult place rolling back these benefits. Once a significant portion of the population has been given benefits as part of a government expansion, it is very difficult, no matter how much ideological will there is, it's very difficult to roll those back. So, since it's so difficult to roll those benefits back at the federal level, what options were there aside from the federal level to the Republican Party? There's basically two: the state governments and the courts. So first of all, the state governments. The Republicans have been more successful. Sorry. The Republicans have been more successful in using their traditional preference for state versus federal government to try to attack Obamacare. There's two ways in which they've used the states to attack the Affordable Care Act. First of all, some states have simply refused the possibility of accepting the Medicaid expansion. It seems to be shooting yourself in the foot. It seems to be self-destructive to do this. But a number of states have actually said, we don't want those extra federal funds. And if the states don't request them, then the federal government doesn't give that Medicaid expansion to the states. So a number of ruby red, strongly Republican states have simply refused to accept the Medicaid expansion that was open to them as part of the ACA. States like Texas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Wyoming, South Dakota, but also some swing states where you have a very strong divide in the population between Democratic and Republican constituents. States like Wisconsin, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, where Republican governors play to their base. They have a strong Republican base, and they play to that base by refusing this feature of the ACA law. So a number of states are simply not part of the Medicaid expansion. Second way in which state governments can be used to resist the ACA, state governments can make legal challenges to the ACA at the state court level that are designed in such a way as to try to call into question a point of constitutional law. Right? You make a challenge at the state level that is based on the interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. And so it's a challenge that is designed to work its way up through the court system all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court will have to rule on the constitutionality of the ACA. And this has been the Republicans' preference for how to take apart Obamacare, using the judiciary to declare that the act is unconstitutional. The judiciary in the U.S. has been growing consistently more conservative since 1980, since Reagan's election in 1980, and using challenges in court is really quite clearly the most effective way that the Republicans could challenge the Affordable Care Act. Think about it. You nullify the law. You're not politically responsible. You don't have to bear the political burden of being the lawmaker who takes benefits away from people. And at the same time, you can say, well, the reason that the law has been undone is because Obama and the Democratic Party were acting unconstitutionally. They were not defending the Constitution as they had claimed to. They were engaging in executive overreach and abuse of power that is detrimental to common citizens. So if the Supreme Court had undone the ACA, politically, the Republicans would have had it all. They would have been able to nullify the legislation. They wouldn't be the ones taking away people's benefits. The courts would, and they would be able to accuse Obama of being un-American, of having overreached his mandate as president. So that was the dream scenario for the Republican Party, but it has not played out in that way, at least up until now. There have been 3 major suits against the ACA that have gone up to the U.S. Supreme Court. 2 of them you see in front of you here, and a third is currently about to be heard by the Supreme Court. So the first one, the most serious one, 2012 National Federation of Independent Business versus Sibelius. So the year of Obama's re-election. The Supreme Court hears a challenge to the individual mandate. And the Supreme Court decides by a 5-4 majority, so just like the John McCain moment, 1 vote that saves the ACA, the Supreme Court decides that the individual mandate is constitutional. The key vote is cast by the Chief Justice, John Roberts, so a Republican who, like John McCain, sides with the progressives and says, no, we might not like the law, but the law is constitutional. And on what grounds? He says it's constitutional because the Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. So Roberts finds that the Obamacare legislation is constitutional based on the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, that the Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. So ironically, the fact that Obama has displeased progressives in his party and has set up the Affordable Care Act as a system of private exchanges, right? That Obamacare has been based on this idea of health insurance as commerce, interstate commerce, is what saves the legislation in this decision of 2012. The individual mandate is constitutional because it's part of Congress's effort to regulate interstate commerce in the domain of health services. Second case, a slightly more flimsy case, King versus Burwell, a challenge to the outlay of tax credits to qualifying persons in all states. So this is, in other words, a challenge against the tax credits allowing low-income Americans to buy health insurance. And the challenge was, well, if the states don't accept the markets, right, if these are states that refuse the Medicaid expansion and refuse to establish state-level insurance marketplaces, then the federal government shouldn't have the right to interfere in the affairs of that state. It should be just a matter for the states as to whether they open themselves to these marketplaces or not. So they try to set up the challenge to Obamacare basically as a state right issue, the rights of the states versus the federal government. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that such credits are constitutional, regardless of what choice the states have made with regard to the marketplaces, and they thus uphold the ACA. I give you just the Wikipedia links. Wikipedia is fine for factual information on cases like this. There's very detailed summary of each of these cases that you can find either in the Supreme Court page or more usable, the Wikipedia page. And then at present, we're currently in the process of a third and probably final at this point challenge to the ACA at the Supreme Court level. A case that's brought within the state of Texas, again focusing on the individual mandate, which conservatives have always seen as being the weak part of this law. And the suit this time claims that once the Trump tax cuts were passed, the Trump tax cuts that eliminate the penalty for enforcing the individual mandate, that means that the individual mandate is unconstitutional because there's no federal tax to enforce it. And since the individual mandate is a central tenet of the ACA, the Supreme Court should deem the whole law to be unconstitutional. This has very little chance of passing. Progressives are nervous because the Supreme Court has become even more conservative in the past year. following the death of Justice Ginsburg and her replacement by a new Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett. Yet most legal scholars are astonished that this case has even made it up to the Supreme Court. It smacks of a frivolous lawsuit. Because the Supreme Court, under Justice Roberts, has been very clear about what they call the severance clause. The severance clause, you can cut something out of a piece of legislation without wanting to change the law as a whole. So you can sever the individual mandate from the ACA without it meaning that Congress doesn't approve of the law as a whole. So it seems very likely that the legal basis for this suit is weak, that even the conservative judges will rule in favor of the ACA on the basis of this severance clause, to simplify things, and that the ACA will withstand this probably final challenge at the Supreme Court level. So having said all of that, look at all of the challenges that this law has had to undergo over the course of 10 years. It's fashionable, I do it sometimes myself, to minimize the legacy of Obama's presidency, to say, well, he could have done more, he made mistakes, he compromised on points he shouldn't have compromised on. But this legislation, faced with incredible resistance, has proved to be very robust, has reshaped the way that people think about the federal government, has improved healthcare for tens of millions of people, and has halved almost the uninsured rate in the United States. So when you think about the types of challenges that were brought about against this law, and the fact that the law was able to withstand those challenges, that in itself is a remarkable achievement. One of the oral exam questions, I think, from last year was questioning, no, it was a written exam question, sorry, was questioning what Obama actually achieved. And one of the lines in the quote was, aside from Obamacare, aside from healthcare reform, his legislative achievements are small. But aside from the first expansion to the federal government that impacts the lives of tens of millions of people, and is the first expansion of the federal government, since the Johnson administration, and impacts the lives of tens of millions of people, and has withstood all of these challenges, and has established a new set of political, judicial, and ideological precedents. That's a pretty big aside from, right? So it's important to bear in mind just how big a deal this was. Right? To paraphrase Joe Biden, when the bill was passed, this bill was a big deal. All right. Now, just to conclude with the current case before the Supreme Court, the legal basis for the suit is seen as being very weak, and unless there's an absolute enormous surprise, there will be a legal argument made by these conservative judges that the severance clause means we as judges just can't undo an entire law on the basis of one change that lawmakers make a few years later. That would be the end to legislative work in a number of domains. But aside from that legal question, politically, it just seems unthinkable that the Supreme Court in 2020, 10 years after the fact, would take this law apart. Think of how divided the political scene is in the U.S. today. The Supreme Court will be delegitimizing themselves as an impartial institution. They've already done some damage in that domain, but they will be completely delegitimizing themselves as an impartial institution. They will be endangering their own survival as the institution that they are, were they to make such a dramatic decision in the current divided U.S. political scene. The fallout from such a decision would just be enormous. And then think about the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the key features of the Affordable Care Act is to make it impossible to refuse insurance to people with pre-existing conditions. In the pre-2008 health insurance landscape, having contracted COVID-19 could be seen as a pre-existing condition. Right? Get your head around that and think of how difficult in the current context it would be for the Supreme Court to make a decision that would take that protection away from tens, even hundreds of millions of Americans. Okay, so we'll stop there with the key policy issue of Obama's presidency. Health insurance, the Affordable Care Act, the ACA.